What can she even do? If any of you old gentlemen want her, take her quickly. I might just give her away as a gift. My own father said that, about me, to the 30 fund managers and board members sitting around his dinner table. They all laughed. I sat 6 seats away and watched him enjoy it. 7 years. That's how long I'd kept my distance from this family. 7 years since he told me I'd never be worth anything. And now I was back at his table, and nothing had changed except me. He still believed I was nothing. That was his first mistake. He had no idea what I'd spent the last 7 years building. I'd known this was coming for months. I just needed him to finish saying it. My name is Grace Sinclair. I'm 31 years old, and the earliest Christmas memory I carry isn't a tree, a present, or the smell of something warm from the kitchen. It's a hallway. The upstairs hallway of my father's house, specifically. The banister I used to grip with both hands and peer through, watching from above the annual dinner I was never allowed to attend. 30 people, just like tonight. Different faces, same energy. The comfortable hum of people who have never once worried about the bill. I watched from up there every year until I was old enough to understand what the watching meant. Owen. My brother got a red BMW for his 16th birthday. Ribbon on the hood. Our father made a toast about legacy, about the Sinclair name, about what it means to carry something worth carrying. Our mother cried happy tears. My 16th birthday was a card with $200, and my mother's handwriting, careful, apologetic, the way it always looked when she was delivering something she couldn't fix. I was 15 the first time I showed my father something I'd built, a predictive algorithm. Basic by the standards I'd eventually develop, but it worked. I'd tested it, run the numbers, stayed up 3 nights checking the outputs. I slid the laptop across his desk. He pushed it back without reading the screen. Any fool can write a program, Grace. Owen was in the room. He stared at the window and said nothing. I graduated Stanford with honors. My mother sent flowers to my dorm. My father sent nothing, not a call, not a single word. I sat in that auditorium in my cap and gown and told myself it didn't matter. I told myself the work was enough. I was wrong about the work being enough. I wasn't wrong about myself. At 24, I came home with a master's degree and a thesis my advisor had called the most sophisticated risk modeling framework he'd seen from a graduate student in 20 years. I stood in my father's study with the bound copy in my hands, thinking maybe this was the thing that finally made him look. He looked. He offered me a role in technical support, under Owen, who had barely scraped through his undergraduate degree and couldn't have explained my thesis if given a week and a dictionary. Not strategy, not partnership, technical support. My throat tightened. My chin stayed level. No, he leaned back in his chair. The pause was calculated, the same one he used at dinner tables my entire life, right before delivering something he'd been quietly rehearsing. Then go. See how far your algorithms carry you without this name opening doors. I walked out of that study, down the grand staircase, through the foyer, and out the front door, into a cold March afternoon. My coat wasn't buttoned. The wind hit my face like a hand. I never looked back. Here's what I understand now that I didn't then. He pushed that laptop away when I was 15, not because the model was bad, but because it was good. A capable daughter meant the story he'd been telling himself, that I was the spare, the afterthought, the child who didn't quite measure up, had holes in it. A man like Warren Sinclair cannot afford holes in the stories he tells himself. His cruelty was never random. Every dismissal was protection. Every deliberate slight was him shoring up a version of reality where his choices made sense. They laughed at the girl from the upstairs hallway. They had no idea she was already building the thing that would one day determine whether their firms survived. The couch was a pull-out, the kind where the metal bar catches you right in the spine no matter how you position yourself. My apartment in Brooklyn was 400 square feet, 1 window, and a radiator that hissed all night like it had something to prove. I loved it. I worked 3 jobs that first year and a half. Mornings at a diner in Midtown, the kind of place with no name on the outside. Just a menu taped to the glass and coffee served in ceramic mugs you didn't ask for. I poured coffee for men who had eaten at my father's table and never once registered my face. They talked freely in front of the help, the way people always do. I'd learned that particular habit from the upstairs hallway. So I listened to the deals closing and the ones falling apart, to which funds were overextended and which ones were sitting on dry powder. Every evening I carried those details home in my head, sat at my kitchen table, and ran models until 2 in the morning. The second job was a data analytics contract, a mid-size hedge fund that hired me through a consultant referral and never asked my last name. They wanted clean, accurate work, delivered on schedule. That's exactly what they received. The third was a weekend consulting arrangement with a tech startup that couldn't afford a full-time analyst. They paid me in equity. Small stakes, the kind that look like nothing until the company gets acquired 3 years later, and the nothing becomes $240,000 wired to an account my father didn't know existed. By month 18, I had $210,000 saved. Every dollar earned, every dollar documented, no safety net, no Sinclair name attached to any of it. Then I went looking for the right 6 people, not Warren's people. I'd spent 2 years listening at the margins of his world, and I knew exactly which investors operated quietly, small enough to move fast, experienced enough to read a model without needing a famous name attached to feel confident. I approached 7, 6 wired money within a week. The 7th passed, his loss. One of the 6 called me 6 months later, after our first returns came in. He said, "I've been doing this for 30 years. You were the only person who ever explained the downside before the upside." That's how I knew. I registered the fund as Gravenhill Ventures LLC, a Delaware holding company. The principles of record ran through a boutique legal firm. My name appeared nowhere in any public filing. That was not an accident. That was architecture. Warren knew everyone on Wall Street. A single whispered warning to the right managing director. That's all it would have taken to poison years of work before it had a chance to breathe. So I became invisible on purpose. I built in the dark, because the dark was the one place he couldn't reach. Then Camille walked into a meeting, sat down across from me, read 40 pages of my fund thesis in silence, and said, "This changes things. Not this is interesting, not this has potential, but this changes things." She became my partner, my one person who knew. The numbers tell the rest without sentiment. Year 1. $3 million in seed capital from 6 people who trusted the math. Year 3, $500 million under management. Year 6, $2.3 billion in the fund. Personal stake, $340 million liquid, with paper value approaching 9 figures. By every metric my father had spent his career respecting, I had already won. He had absolutely no idea. I kept it that way, not because I was afraid of him, but because I needed him to say it one more time, in front of the right people, before I answered. Leonard Ford called on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks before Christmas. I picked up on the second ring. Leonard doesn't do small talk. He never has. That's one of the reasons I trusted him. "Warren Sinclair approached Reed Capital last month," he said. "Emergency partnership. He needs capital and he needs technology. His algorithmic trading expansion failed. The Singapore office is bleeding out. We're talking 8 figures in losses. They've been papering over for 2 quarters. Without outside intervention, Sinclair Group folds within a year." I leaned back in my chair. "The technology he needs," Leonard continued, "belongs to GV Capital." A beat of silence stretched between us. "He came begging to my fund," I said, without knowing it was mine. "He has no idea." A pause. "Grace. He's been sending feelers to every major capital partner on the street. He landed on us because of our track record, with algorithmic infrastructure. I've known who you are for 6 months. I've said nothing to anyone. I knew why he'd waited. Leonard Ford didn't collect secrets, he saved them. He was the kind of man who held a card until the table was worth playing it at. "Tell me about the agreement structure," I said. He walked me through it. The partnership deal Reed Capital had drafted included a material misrepresentation override clause, standard language, the kind present in virtually every significant institutional capital agreement at this level. The clause states that if the operating partner is found to have made materially false representations to investors During the disclosure period, the capital partner may assume temporary operational oversight, pending independent review. Warren's lawyers reviewed it. They flagged it as boilerplate. Nobody had triggered language like that in 30 years of finance, because firms that manage their books honestly don't misrepresent their positions to capital partners. Warren skimmed past it. He was too desperate, too impatient, and too certain he was the most intelligent person in every room he entered to read carefully what he was signing. What he didn't know, what his own CFO had quietly buried in the preliminary disclosure documents, was that the Singapore losses were larger than reported, not deliberate fraud. Something worse, in a way, the sloppy, panicked corner-cutting of a company trying to appear healthier than it is long enough to close a deal. The clause wasn't a trap I had designed. It was a standard mechanism sitting inside a document Warren had rushed through, waiting for the moment his own carelessness made it live. I told Leonard I'd think about it. I already knew the answer. The invitation arrived 4 days later. Cream paper. My mother's handwriting precise. Even the penmanship she reserved for things my father dictated. "We hope this invitation finds you well. We would be honored by your presence at our annual Christmas Eve dinner at the Meridian Club." My father's stationery, my mother's hand, his words entirely. I called her. She answered on the first ring, which meant she'd been waiting. She held herself together for almost 40 seconds before her voice cracked. She said they'd very much like me to come. She said my father felt enough time had passed. She delivered all the careful, rehearsed things Warren had told her to say, in exactly the order he'd told her to say them. Underneath the script, her voice carried a different conversation, smaller, sadder, the voice of a woman who had spent decades delivering messages she hadn't written. What the invitation actually said was far simpler. "You are a useful prop for our comeback announcement. Dress accordingly." I RSVP'd yes. Then I called Owen. My brother had spent 34 years being everything our father needed him to be: the heir, the proof, the living reflection of Warren's legacy. The weight of that role had been aging him quietly for years. I could hear it every time we spoke, that particular exhaustion that comes not from working hard, but from performing endlessly. When I told him what I'd built, he went completely still. Not the polite quiet of someone gathering a response. The real kind. The kind where you can hear someone recalibrating everything they thought they knew. It lasted almost a full minute. Then he said, "Just tell me where to stand." Leonard was positioned. Owen was positioned. The room was set. The trap wasn't something I had constructed. Warren built it himself through desperation, through impatience, through a lifelong habit of skimming what he should have read carefully. I hadn't engineered his downfall. I had simply confirmed my attendance. I wore black. Simple cut, no statement jewelry. Heels I'd owned for 4 years. I wanted to look exactly like what he expected, the struggling daughter. The loose end that never quite tied itself off. The prop who had shown up because she had nowhere better to be on Christmas Eve. Warren spotted me across the foyer the moment I walked in. He managed a nod, the kind reserved for someone whose name you've nearly forgotten. "You made it." Then he turned back to his circle without missing a beat. "Gentlemen, my daughter." Various interests. The laughter came right on schedule. I took my seat at the far end of the table. I noticed Meredith 2 chairs from Warren, his VP of Communications, the woman who'd spent 3 weeks building the comeback announcement he planned to deliver that evening. A folder sat beside her plate. Her pen was already uncapped. She was the only other professional in the room who understood, in precise terms, exactly what the night was supposed to be worth. 30 minutes passed. Excellent wine. Performative conversation. Then Warren set down his knife and fork with the deliberateness of a man who has rehearsed the gesture. The table quieted. Automatic. Years of conditioning at work. "So, Grace." His eyes traveled the length of the table to find mine. "Still at that job? Or have you finally found something real?" "I'm doing fine." His smile held steady. Fine is what mediocre people say when they have nothing to show. He glanced around to confirm everyone was following. They were. "What have you actually built? What do you have to show for 31 years? My mother's knuckles went white around her wine glass. Owen's jaw locked. He pushed his chair back and started to rise. The smallest shake of my head. He read it. sat back down. Warren raised his glass toward me. The gesture looked like a toast. It wasn't. When you look at your empty wallet and your empty life, do you finally understand what you gave up? Leonard Ford stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Warren. Before you finish that thought, there's something the room should know. Warren laughed, uncertain. Leonard, this is a family. Grace Sinclair runs GV Capital. Leonard's tone was even, unhurried. She has been running it for 6 years. She is worth more than your firm and mine combined, and the partnership you announced tonight is your great comeback. He slid a document across the white tablecloth. It exists because she hasn't cancelled it yet. The room went completely still. Warren picked up the document. His hands were steady, a lifetime of discipline in those hands. His face was not. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again without producing a single word. 2 chairs away, Meredith looked down at her folder, the comeback announcement, 3 weeks of careful preparation, and closed it slowly. The way you close something you already know you'll throw away, she said quietly, to no one in particular. I should have taken the other offer. She gathered her things and left without looking back. Owen stood, not to speak, simply to stand. Every head in the room turned, registered it, and understood exactly what it meant. My chair scraped back. I walked the full length of that table, stopped directly in front of my father, close enough to see the muscle working steadily in his jaw, the only part of him still fighting. The algorithms you called foolish dreams, the daughter you told to go and fail alone, the technology your company is begging for. My voice stayed level, unhurried. That's mine. All of it. His eyes moved across my face, searching for something to hold on to. You spent 24 years making sure I knew I was nothing. I spent 7 building proof that you were wrong. I picked up my bag. Owen was already moving toward the door. Then my mother crossing that long table, crossing years of practiced silence, taking my hand in both of hers and holding on, weeping openly, not performing grief, just finally, for the first time in her life, choosing. Near the exit, Leonard fell into step beside me for a brief moment. I've been waiting 6 months to do that, he said quietly. Then he was gone. I stepped through the door without looking back. Behind me, for the first time in anyone's memory, Warren Sinclair stood at the head of his table with nothing to say. 3 days after Christmas, the restructuring was already moving. Owen had stepped into the operational transition with the focused energy of a man who had been waiting years for something genuinely worth doing. Camille was managing communications. The legal team was working through the partnership documents in organized shifts. For one quiet afternoon, it almost felt like it was simply over. It wasn't. 24 hours after the dinner, a letter arrived through my lawyer's office, Warren's legal team. The language was measured no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no admission of anything that had happened at the Meridian Club. The proposal was straightforward. GV Capital withdraws from the Sinclair Group partnership. Both parties sign a confidentiality agreement, sealing everything, and in exchange, a one-time payment of $4 million, wired within 5 business days. Camille read it over my shoulder. She was quiet for a moment. It ends the public exposure, she said, not pushing, just stating the math. My lawyer documented receipt, noted the time, noted the date, logged every detail of what Warren's team had just committed to writing their full awareness of the situation, their desperation to contain it, their willingness to pay for silence. Then she sent a one-word reply, declined. 48 hours after the dinner, with the settlement refused, Warren made his second move. It was more calculated than the first. He sent no emails, nothing traceable, nothing in writing. He used intermediaries, phone calls, carefully worded suggestions passed through people with no obvious connection to him. The target wasn't me directly. It was my fund. One of GV Capital's limited partners received a call. A woman who had invested in the fund's second year, specifically because she had read my model and believed in the work. The message she received was methodical. GV Capital was under regulatory review. The fund's returns were under scrutiny. The founder's background had unresolved questions that hadn't yet surfaced publicly. The strategy was rational. Unsettle the limited partners. trigger redemptions, force me into a liquidity position that weakened my leverage before the restructuring finalized. He couldn't stop what was coming through legitimate channels, so he tried to destabilize the foundation beneath me instead. It was the desperate maneuver of a man who had exhausted all viable options, comprehensively desperate, and ultimately, catastrophically miscalculated. Because the limited partner he called wasn't frightened, she was offended. She called Camille directly that same afternoon. She didn't want her name used. She simply wanted someone to know. Camille reached me at 6:47 in the evening. Her voice was tight and precise, the register she uses when something requires immediate action. My hand stayed flat on the desk. He still hadn't learned. One call to Leonard. One call to my legal team. The statements Warren's intermediaries had made were now documented, dated, and recipient confirmed. On their own, they constituted tortious interference. Combined with the $4 million settlement offer sent 24 hours earlier, which established on the record that Warren Sinclair had complete awareness of his own exposure, they potentially constituted material misrepresentation to investors during an active partnership. Disclosure period. The SEC whistleblower tip was filed before noon the following day. Warren's own board convened an emergency session that same afternoon. They didn't wait for a press release or a phone call from anyone. They reviewed what was in front of them, the Singapore losses, the disclosure irregularities, the documented settlement attempt, the whistleblower filing, and made the only rational decision available to people protecting their own reputations. They voted to place Warren Sinclair on administrative leave, pending independent review. His phone rang once that evening, my number on the screen. He answered immediately. It was my lawyer's voice, not mine. The press release went out at 4 in the afternoon. GV Capital founder Grace Sinclair to oversee Sinclair Group technology restructuring. Warren Sinclair steps back from operational decisions, effective January 1st. The material misrepresentation override clause, the boilerplate language his own lawyers had called standard, the line he had skimmed past in his rush to close the deal before his company bled out entirely. He signed it himself. He wasn't the most powerful person in that transaction. She simply decided when. The independent review concluded in February. Warren Sinclair was removed from the board of Sinclair Group by a vote of 7-2 on a Tuesday morning. The SEC inquiry, opened on the basis of the whistleblower filing, resulted in a formal finding of material misrepresentation in the Singapore disclosure documents. His CFO accepted a negotiated settlement, a $230,000 fine, and a 5-year ban from serving as a financial officer in any publicly registered entity. Warren's personal liability, separate from the company's, resulted in a civil judgment of $1.4 million in damages to the limited partners whose investment decisions had been shaped by the false disclosure figures. Sinclair Group didn't collapse. That had never been the goal. Under the restructuring agreement, the firm was reorganized around GV Capital's technology infrastructure over the following 18 months. 83 employees kept their jobs. The Singapore office was wound down cleanly. Warren's name was removed from the company letterhead before the end of January, a change so administrative, so devoid of drama, that it appeared in no headline, just a line in a filing. A name, and then the absence of it. The community he'd spent 30 years cultivating quietly realigned within 3 weeks. The men who had laughed at that dinner table found reasons not to return his calls. The board seats evaporated, the charity gala invitations, cream envelopes that had arrived every year for decades, embossed with names he'd spent a career collecting, stopped coming. He didn't lose everything in a single dramatic moment. He lost it gradually, without ceremony, the same way he'd spent a lifetime making others feel small incrementally, until one day the room was simply empty. 8 months later, a letter arrived at my lawyer's office and was forwarded to me without comment. Warren's handwriting on the envelope, I recognized the forward slant from a lifetime of seeing it on documents that never had my name at the top. I opened it standing at my kitchen counter, still in my coat. The language was measured, reflective, he called it. He said both parties had perhaps made mistakes. He said that with time, A conversation might be possible. And then the sentence that confirmed everything. I am still your father. As if that were an argument. As if the word father were a debt I owed rather than a role he had auditioned for and ultimately abandoned. I folded the letter back into its envelope, set it in the recycling bin under the counter, put the kettle on. My chest held nothing sharp, just the quiet, unremarkable calm of a woman who has already moved on, choosing not to move backward. That was the moment I knew it was genuinely over. The Christmas that mattered happened in Owen's kitchen. Serena had cooked something ambitious, involving 3 different kinds of cheese, and a recipe she'd saved specifically for the occasion. Their children were in pajamas by 7 in the evening. There was a gingerbread house on the counter that had clearly suffered some kind of structural catastrophe, one wall missing entirely, the roof sitting at an angle that defied architectural logic. The children were enormously proud of it. Camille arrived with wine and the quiet energy of someone who had spent a year watching a plan execute precisely and was finally allowing herself to enjoy the result. She sat beside me on the couch, and we never once mentioned work the entire evening. Owen caught my eye across the room at one point, one of those glances that needs no translation. His shoulders were different, looser. The performance had ended, and the man underneath it turned out to be warm, funny, and a genuinely terrible judge of how spicy food should be, which made everyone at the table laugh. Serena sent me a photo the following morning. The demolished gingerbread house, the children in their pajamas, the kitchen still pleasantly wrecked in the background. I held my phone and looked at it for a long time. That was what Warren Sinclair lost. Not the company, not the title, not the board seats or the embossed envelopes or the rooms full of people laughing on cue. The kitchen, the demolished gingerbread house, the kind of evening that asks nothing of anyone except that they show up and stay. He made his choices. The cost wasn't settled in a courtroom. It was paid in ordinary Tuesdays he will never get back. So here is what I want to say to you, whoever you are, wherever this finds you. The people who dismiss you earliest are often the most afraid of what you might become. The cruelty directed at you when you are young and trying is rarely about what you did wrong. It is about what you threatened, simply, by being capable. That doesn't make it acceptable. It doesn't mean forgiveness is owed on any timeline but your own, but it does mean their verdict was never a ruling. It was a fear, wearing a verdict's face. Building quietly is sometimes the only way to build safely. But silence is a strategy, not a permanent condition. The goal was never to remain invisible. The goal was to become too real to ignore. Find your one, Camille, the person who treats your work as real before the rest of the world has decided whether it is. One person is enough. One person changes the entire shape of the work. And the version of you that wants to watch the person who hurt you burn completely, that version is still standing in the room where the wound happened. You are allowed to leave that room. Accountability is not the same as destruction. Making someone face real consequences is entirely different from needing to watch them bleed. One is justice. The other is a chain you fasten around yourself and choose to call revenge. You are allowed to walk away from people who diminish you, even when you share a last name. Blood is not a contract. It is not a reason to remain in a room that has always made you smaller. Build the thing. Build it quietly, if you have to. Build it on a pull-out couch with a metal bar in your spine and 3 jobs and a model you run at 2 a.m. because no one will believe in it until the numbers are impossible to argue with. The light comes when you're ready for it to. I promise you that. If this story reached you at the right moment, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have been the grace in someone else's story, tell me in the comments. I read every single one.